The water above Aboukir Bay begins as a sheet of brightness, broken by a survey boat, then the diver descends. Blue turns green, green turns brown. Within a few meters, the world narrows to the beam of a lamp and the sound of breathing. Fine Nile silt hangs in the water like smoke, disturbed by the slightest movement. The seabed appears flat until the light catches an edge too straight to be natural. A carved surface emerges from the mud, then a shoulder, a crown. The face of a colossal stone figure lies where no royal image was meant to rest. Beneath 10 meters of water and centuries of sediment. Nearby, blocks once fitted into a temple wall disappear into darkness. What looks like wreckage is the broken geometry of a city. This is not Atlantis in any scientific sense, though the comparison is often irresistible. Thonis-Heracleion was not a mythical island erased in a single night. It was a documented Egyptian port at the edge of the Nile Delta, known to ancient writers, visited by merchants, guarded by officials, and shaped by priests, sailors, builders, and rulers. Today its remains lie roughly 6.5 to 7 kilometers beyond the modern shoreline, submerged in western Aboukir Bay. The city is real, but the landscape that once held it has changed so completely that its streets now belong to the sea. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the mystery here is not simply how a city sank, it is how a place built entirely around water could become powerful through the same forces that would one day undo it. To understand that contradiction, the modern coastline must be forgotten. The Nile Delta of antiquity was not a fixed triangle drawn cleanly against the Mediterranean. It was an unstable plain of river branches, lagoons, marshes, sandbars, mudbanks, islands, and shallow lakes. Channels shifted, floods laid down sediment, storms pushed seawater inland. Land that seemed firm could be compacted silt resting over waterlogged layers. On this uncertain ground, settlements rose because the river made them possible. The Nile carried grain, stone, timber, people, taxes, messages, and royal authority. The sea opened Egypt toward the Aegean, Cyprus, Phoenicia, and the wider Mediterranean. Where river and sea met, opportunity gathered. Thonis-Heracleion stood near one of the most important western entrances to the Nile. Ships approaching Egypt from the Mediterranean did not encounter a simple open river mouth. They entered a complex threshold where navigation, taxation, religion, and political control overlapped. The city occupied low islands and ridges divided by canals and harbour basins. Its waterfronts received cargoes and foreign crews. Its officials examined goods and collected revenue. Its temples gave sacred meaning to arrival. In practical terms, it was a checkpoint. In symbolic terms, it was a gate into Egypt. That gate was not modest. Beneath the bay lie fragments of colossal statues, inscriptions, ritual objects, anchors, ceramics, quays, ship timbers, and monumental architecture. Yet the grandeur of individual finds can mislead. This was not a single temple standing alone by the sea, nor an intact stone metropolis waiting beneath clear water. Much of the urban landscape survives as buried traces, displaced blocks, collapsed structures, sediment-filled channels, and objects separated from their settings. Archaeologists reconstruct the city by combining geophysical maps with excavated points and distinguishing ancient features from later disturbance. The resulting plan is powerful, but remains an interpretation assembled from incomplete evidence. Even the scale requires care. The often repeated dimensions of 11 by 15 kilometers refer to the wider zone studied in western Aboukir Bay, not to Thonis-Heracleion itself. The research area contains more than one ancient site and a broad, drowned landscape. Canopus, another important city, lay nearby, linked by waterways and ritual movement, but it was not another name for Thonis-Heracleion. Alexandria, farther west, later dominated the region. The bay preserves a changing coastal world, and the lost port was only one part of it, though perhaps the most strategically placed. Its position explains both its rise and its vulnerability. A harbour city needs access to deep enough water, but it also needs shelter, navigable channels, stable banks, and constant maintenance. Thonis-Heracleion depended on all of these. Its inhabitants lived with mud, tides, seasonal floods, and the slow movement of the delta. They dredged, repaired, built, rebuilt, and adapted. Wooden structures reinforced waterfronts. Quays controlled landing points. Canals connected harbour zones with the interior. Sacred and commercial traffic used the same aquatic spaces. Water was not scenery. It was the city's road system, defensive boundary, source of wealth, and organizing principle. What survives in the record suggests that the settlement began to take shape around the 8th century BC, although scholars still debate aspects of its earliest development. By the 6th century BC, it had become a major centre of exchange, and from the 6th through the 4th centuries BC it reached its greatest prosperity. Foreign pottery arrived in quantity. Egyptian authority was made visible through monuments and decrees. Greek visitors knew the city as Heracleion, while Egyptians called it Thonis. Those names would later confuse scholars, but for the people who used them, they referred to the same crowded port. The water above the ruins now hides nearly every feature that once made the place legible. There is no skyline, no temple facade rising over ships, no line of warehouses against the horizon. Visibility can collapse when sediment lifts from the bottom. Divers often work at arm's length from objects whose full size cannot be seen until measurements, photographs, and sonar data are assembled. A massive statue may first appear as a patch of stone. A wall may be recognized only through repeated passes. A shipwreck can remain concealed beneath clay after the surrounding area has been mapped. This obscurity gives the city its atmosphere of mystery, but the fascination lies deeper than spectacle. Thonis-Heracleion was not merely lost beneath water, it was lost beneath changing geography, beneath new centres of power, beneath the silting and shifting of river mouths, and beneath centuries in which written references survived without a secure location. Its disappearance was gradual enough to blur memory, yet complete enough to make the city seem almost legendary. On the seabed, the colossal face remains calm beneath the lamp. Silt drifts across its features and settles again. The diver moves onward, following a line of stone into darkness, and the vanished port begins to reveal its first truth. It did not belong to the sea at the beginning. It became a city because water gathered the ancient world at its door. The sea came later, slowly taking possession of the gate that once opened Egypt to everyone beyond the horizon. Long before sonar traced buried walls beneath Aboukir Bay, the city existed as a problem in old books. Its stones had disappeared, its shoreline had vanished, and its name survived in fragments scattered across Greek and Roman literature. To later readers, those fragments seem to point toward a place both historical and half mythic, standing somewhere near the western mouths of the Nile. The difficulty was not that ancient writers had forgotten it. The difficulty was that they remembered it in ways that mixed geography, ritual, politics, and legend so closely that each clue required caution. Herodotus provides one of the most famous accounts. Writing in the 5th century BC, he places a sanctuary of Heracles near the canopic mouth of the Nile, and connects the location with the story of Paris and Helen. In his version, Paris reaches Egypt while carrying Helen away from Sparta. Contrary winds drive his ships toward the Nile, where servants reveal what has happened. The matter comes before a local guardian of the river mouth named Thonis, and eventually before the Egyptian king. Helen remains in Egypt while Paris is ordered to leave. The tale was important to Herodotus because it offered an alternative to the familiar epic tradition, but it is not a municipal archive. It belongs to a landscape in which mythic characters move through recognizable places. That distinction matters. Herodotus gives evidence that a place called Thonis and a sanctuary associated with Heracles were known within the geography of Egypt as he understood it. He also preserves a tradition linking the region to seaborne arrival, border control, and the authority of officials at the mouth of the Nile. Those themes fit remarkably well with what archaeology later revealed about the port. Yet the presence of Paris and Helen does not allow anyone to date the foundation of the city to the age in which the Trojan War was supposed to have occurred. Myth can preserve memories of roots, sanctuaries, or local prestige, but it cannot be treated as a construction certificate. The ancient account is therefore both valuable and dangerous. Read carelessly, it becomes proof of whatever a modern storyteller wishes to claim. Read critically, it shows how the city was imagined in the 5th century BC as a threshold where foreigners entered Egypt, where sacred authority stood close to commercial movement, and where access to the Nile could be controlled. Even the figure of Thonis, whether understood as an official, a legendary person, or an explanation for the place name, reflects the importance of guarding the river's edge. Centuries later, Strabo offers a more explicitly geographical picture. Writing around the transition from the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD, he describes the region east of Alexandria and places Heracleion near Canopus and the canopic mouth. His world is not the same as Herodotus's. Alexandria now dominates the coast. Political authority has changed repeatedly, and the old port has lost much of its former international importance. Still, Heracleion remains recognizable as a named location within a network of settlements, waterways, and religious sites. Strabo's placement became crucial because Canopus was also known from texts, inscriptions, and later archaeology. But his description did not provide a modern map coordinate. The Nile Delta had changed too much. River branches migrated or disappeared. Coastlines retreated. Bays formed over areas that had once been dry or marshy ground. A statement that made sense to an ancient traveller could become almost impossible to transfer onto a modern chart. The city remained present in language while absent from the land. This mismatch helped create one of the enduring confusions surrounding the site. Some readers treated Thonis and Heracleion as neighbouring settlements. Others suspected that one was a district, harbour, or older name attached to the other. The sources did not immediately resolve the question, partly because Greek authors naturally favoured the Greek name, while Egyptian inscriptions used an Egyptian form. Without the physical city, scholars were left comparing words across languages and centuries. Canopus added another layer. It was genuinely a separate nearby city, prominent in its own right and connected to Thonis-Heracleion through waterways, commerce, and religious ceremony. because both cities stood within the same unstable coastal zone, and both later disappeared beneath or beside the waters of Aboukir Bay. Their histories could easily blur. Ancient descriptions place them close together, but closeness is not identity. The evidence remains incomplete in many details, yet the surviving texts consistently make better sense when Canopus is treated as distinct and Thonis-Heracleion as a single city with two names. For generations, however, certainty was impossible. Maps proposed locations. Scholars examined changing branches of the Nile. Archaeologists and historians compared references to temples, harbours, and settlements. The city could be discussed, but not walked. It occupied an uncomfortable category too well documented to dismiss as fiction, yet too geographically elusive to place with confidence. There was also a quieter irony in this survival. Monumental capitals can vanish while a place name endures in copied manuscripts, repeated by scribes who never saw the coast being described. The city persisted as language after it ceased to persist as visible ground, a historical presence detached from geography. That uncertainty explains why the modern discovery felt like the recovery of something legendary, even though the city itself had never been purely a legend. Herodotus and Strabo had kept it alive, but they had also preserved it through the conventions of their own worlds. One wrote history that included marvels, oral traditions, and mythic alternatives. The other described a coastline already transformed by the rise of Alexandria. Neither was writing for underwater archaeologists 2,000 years later. The most surprising feature of their testimony is not that every detail proved correct. It is that the broad pattern endured. There really was a major settlement near the Canopic mouth. It really was associated in Greek tradition with Heracles, while its central Egyptian sanctuary belonged to Amun-Gereb. It really did function as a controlled entrance into Egypt, and it really did stand close to, but separate from, Canopus. Still, texts alone could not settle the city's location or identity. They could narrow the search, shape hypotheses, and warn researchers what kinds of evidence might matter. They could not reveal walls beneath mud or distinguish a buried harbour from a natural channel. For that, the old stories had to meet instruments capable of reading a drowned landscape. By the late 20th century, the name had survived for more than 2 millennia without a secure place on the map. Somewhere beyond the modern coast, beneath water that concealed distance and scale, the city waited as a pattern of stone, timber, metal, and sediment. The written clues had reached as far as they could. The next step required turning the bay itself into a document. The old texts had reduced the search to a frustrating truth somewhere near the ancient Canopic mouth. Under a coastline that no longer existed, lay the remains of a major port. That was not enough. Western Aboukir Bay covers a vast, shallow, sediment-heavy landscape where natural channels, buried islands, wreckage, modern debris, and ancient structures overlap. A diver could pass within meters of a wall and never see it. To find a city in such water, the researchers first had to stop thinking like treasure hunters and begin treating the bay as a system. In 1996, the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology, led by Frank Gaudio, began a sustained investigation of the area. The work did not begin with a dramatic descent onto a temple. It began with survey lines, instruments, calibration, and the slow accumulation of data. Boats crossed the bay repeatedly in measured patterns while equipment recorded variations in depth, magnetism, sediment, and buried relief. The objective was not to search for a single statue or inscription. It was to reconstruct an entire drowned environment before excavation disturbed it. Multi-beam echo sounding helped reveal the shape of the seabed. Side-scan sonar sent acoustic signals outward, creating images from differences in the way surfaces reflected sound. Hard stone, soft sediment, timber, and irregular debris produced different signatures. A nuclear magnetic resonance magnetometer detected anomalies caused by metal and by contrast hidden beneath the bottom. Satellite positioning allowed each reading to be fixed to a precise location, while sub-bottom and direct seabed investigations helped distinguish recent deposits from deeper archaeological layers. None of these instruments produced a ready-made picture labelled Ancient City. Their results appeared as patterns lines that might be walls, clusters that might be architectural blocks, depressions that might represent channels, and magnetic disturbances that could come from anchors, wrecks, or modern objects. Every anomaly had alternatives. Nature creates straight-looking edges. Fishing activity moves material. War and industry leave debris. The evidence had to be tested, compared, and mapped before anyone could make a historical claim. This method required patience because underwater archaeology works against visibility and context. On land, a wall may be followed across a trench. Underwater, it can vanish beneath silt after a few meters. A structure visible in sonar may be almost invisible to a diver. A large stone can seem isolated until the broader map shows that it belongs to a temple precinct. Even an inscription, spectacular as it is, gains its full meaning only when its position is understood in relation to channels, buildings, and other finds. The team therefore moved between scales. Broad surveys identified promising zones. Smaller grids refined the readings. Divers and remote equipment inspected selected targets. Test trenches exposed buried features without stripping away entire areas. Measurements returned to the central map, where each new object altered the interpretation of the city around it. Discovery was not a single moment but a loop detect, verify, record, compare, and return. By 2000, the first finds allowed the researchers to identify the remains of Thonis-Heracleion. The date matters because it separates the beginning of the regional study from the moment when evidence became strong enough to name the city. 4 years of survey had not been empty preparation. They'd created the framework that made identification possible. Without that framework, a statue might have been admired without revealing which city it belonged to, and a wall might have remained only an anonymous ruin in the bay. The initial recognition did not end the search, it enlarged it. Once the city could be placed, researchers needed to establish its boundaries, internal waterways, harbour installations, sacred areas, and relationship with nearby Canopus. The wider research zone, often described as roughly 11 by 15 kilometres, covered a broad sector of western Aboukir Bay. It should not be mistaken for the dimensions of Thonis-Heracleion itself. Within that drowned landscape lay multiple ancient environments and sites, each shaped by the movement of the Nile and the Mediterranean. A lesser-known difficulty was that the ancient terrain had not merely been flooded, it had deformed. Sediment compacted, ground failed, buildings collapsed and slid, channels filled, heavy blocks sank into softer layers, objects moved during later storms or human activity. The map archaeologists were creating was therefore not a frozen city plan, preserved exactly at the instant of abandonment. It was a damaged and transformed record whose features had to be read through geological change. That is why technology alone could not solve the mystery. Sonar can show form, but not always date or function. Magnetometers can locate anomalies, but not tell whether an anchor was lost, discarded, reused, or offered ritually. Satellite coordinates can fix a point with precision, but precision is not interpretation. The instruments made the invisible measurable. Archaeology still had to explain what those measurements meant. Gradually, the bay began to acquire structure. Lines of stone suggested quays. Concentrations of anchors marked areas of repeated mooring. Buried hulls revealed former waterways and harbour edges. Monumental blocks indicated a central temple zone. Canals emerged not as blue lines on a modern reconstruction, but as patterns in depth, sediment, architecture, and artifact distribution. The drowned landscape was becoming legible, though never complete. The evidence remains incomplete, and mapping continues because every season can revise the plan. Some areas are deeply buried, others are difficult to excavate without risking fragile remains. Underwater cultural heritage is not simply removed whenever it is found. Preservation in place is often preferable when conditions allow. As a result, much of the city is known through remote sensing, limited trenches, and carefully chosen interventions rather than total exposure. This restraint makes the process less cinematic than the popular image of underwater discovery, but far more revealing. The team did not descend into the bay and stumble upon a lost metropolis waiting intact. They built the city back into existence through thousands of observations. Each acoustic return, each measured block, each ceramic group, and each piece of timber became part of a spatial argument. By the time divers encountered monumental remains, the surrounding data had already begun to answer questions the naked eye could not. A statue was no longer merely a statue, it occupied a sanctuary. A timber belonged to a waterfront or vessel. A channel connected one basin to another. The city was emerging not as a collection of treasures, but as an organized port. And yet one problem remained at the center of the map. Ancient sources had preserved two names, Thonis and Heracleion, and scholars had long debated whether they referred to separate places. Finding a city in the right region was not enough. The ruins themselves would have to settle the question. Beneath the silt, inside the sacred heart of the port, inscriptions were waiting to connect the Egyptian and Greek names to the same ground. The question of the two names had lingered for centuries because language preserved the city in fragments. Greek authors wrote of Heracleion, Egyptian records referred to Thonis. Later scholars could not be certain whether they were looking at two neighbouring ports, an older and a newer settlement, or two names applied to different parts of the same place. The underwater map had established that a major city stood where the text suggested, but geography alone could not resolve identity. The answer had to come from inscriptions found in context, where names, temples, rulers, and locations converged. One of the most important clues came from the sanctuary at the center of the city. There, archaeologists recovered a naos associated with Amun-Gereb, the local form of Amun whose cult gave the city much of its religious importance. The inscription linked this sacred precinct to Heracleion. That mattered because the temple was not a loose object carried in from elsewhere. It belonged to the monumental heart of the submerged settlement, surrounded by architectural remains, ritual deposits, and waterways that defined the city's sacred landscape. Another clue came in gold. A small Greek plaque from the reign of Ptolemy III recorded the construction or restoration of a sacred building for the gods. Gold survives in water with a brightness that seems almost unnatural beside dark stone and grey sediment. But the value of the plaque was not its appearance. Its Greek text showed that the sanctuary participated in the political and religious world of the Ptolemies, rulers who governed Egypt after Alexander's conquest while presenting themselves through both Greek and Egyptian traditions. The decisive evidence, however, was a massive granodiorite stele erected in the first regnal year of Nectanebo-Afen in the early 4th century BC. Its inscription is known as the Decree of Sais. The king ordered that a tenth of certain revenues from imported goods and manufactured products passing through the region be assigned to the temple of the goddess Neith at Sais. The decree also specified where copies of the stele were to stand. One was to be placed at Naucratis, another was to be erected at Thonis, at the mouth of the Sea of the Greeks. That phrasing anchored the Egyptian name to a precise function and landscape. Thonis was not an abstract district somewhere in the delta. It was a controlled point of entry where maritime commerce reached Egypt, a place important enough for royal fiscal policy to be displayed in stone. When the stele was found within the same submerged urban and sacred zone that the Greek evidence identified as Heracleion, the old division between the names became increasingly difficult to sustain. The argument did not depend on a single inscription considered in isolation. Even the placement of these texts mattered, because inscriptions recovered from a sanctuary carry a different evidentiary weight from objects displaced by currents or later disturbance. Archaeological identification becomes strongest when independent lines of evidence reinforce one another. The Naos connected the local cult of Amun-Gereb with Heracleion. The Greek gold plaque placed Ptolemaic sacred activity in the same precinct. The Decree of Sais named Thonis and tied it to the maritime gateway. Ancient geography placed Heracleion in this region near the canopic mouth. Together, these finds indicated that Thonis was the Egyptian name and Heracleion the Greek name for the same city. This was not unusual in a land where languages and political traditions overlapped. Places could be known by different names to different communities without becoming separate settlements. Greek visitors and merchants naturally used a name associated with Heracles, whom they connected with an Egyptian divine landscape. Egyptian officials and priests used Thonis. The names reflected distinct cultural vocabularies, but they referred to one port, one temple zone, and one position at the edge of the Nile. The discovery also corrected another persistent confusion. Canopus was not a third name for the same city. It was a separate settlement nearby, linked to Thonis-Heracleion by waterways and ritual processions. The two cities shared a coastal environment and, eventually, a submerged fate, but their identities remained distinct. This distinction would become essential when later finds from Aboukir Bay were reported, because proximity in the modern bay does not automatically make every object part of Thonis-Heracleion. The Decree of Sais offered more than a name. It revealed the city as an institution. Royal power reached the port through taxation, temple finance, and written law. Foreign cargo was not simply unloaded into an unregulated marketplace. Revenue was measured and redirected according to royal command. The stele stood as a public declaration that the gateway belonged within the political and sacred order of Egypt. Its duplicate at Naucratis is equally revealing. Naucratis lay farther inland and served as another important point in the network connecting foreign merchants with Egyptian authority. The decree linked the two places without making them identical. Thonis-Heracleion controlled the maritime threshold, while Naucratis functioned within the riverine and commercial system deeper in the delta. This helps explain why claims that all Egyptian trade passed through one city in every period go beyond the evidence. The network changed, and more than one center mattered. There is a strange intimacy in the way the mystery was solved. A question that had survived through libraries and scholarly debate was answered not by one spectacular monument, but by names carved for practical purposes. A temple object identified a god, a gold plaque recorded royal piety, a fiscal decree assigned revenue. None was created to help future archaeologists. Their agreement was accidental from the perspective of the people who made them, yet decisive for the people who found them. Scholars still debate details of chronology, urban development, and the precise history of individual structures, but the identification of Thonis with Heracleion is now grounded in a strong convergence of textual and archaeological evidence. The city that ancient authors seem to divide could finally be understood as a bilingual place. That realization changes how the ruins are imagined. The port was not Egyptian on one side and Greek on the other, separated by a neat line. Its names, cults, officials, visitors, and inscriptions occupied the same watery urban space. A sailor approaching from the Mediterranean might know the destination as Heracleion. An Egyptian scribe recording revenue might call it Thonis. Both arrived at the same quays. With the problem of identity resolved, the map gained a human scale. The canals were no longer anonymous channels. The temple precinct was no longer an isolated cluster of stones. The harbour basins belonged to a city whose names reflected the worlds meeting there. To understand how those worlds moved through it, the ruins had to be read not only as monuments, but as streets of water, islands, embankments, and landing places arranged around a living port. The city now had a name, but a name alone could not restore its shape. To imagine Thonis-Heracleion as a conventional land city would be to misunderstand it. Its streets did not simply run between houses on firm ground. The settlements spread across low islands, natural ridges, reclaimed edges, and narrow strips of land divided by channels. Water entered from every direction. Harbours opened into canals. Canals passed beside temples, warehouses, quays, and working areas. Boats moved through spaces where, in another city, carts and pedestrians carried the burden of transport. At the centre stood the sanctuary of Amun-Gereb, raised on relatively higher ground and surrounded by a carefully organised sacred and commercial landscape. North and south of the temple precinct, channels connected different harbour zones. Farther west, a broad canal linked the city with inland waters. Archaeologists often call it the Grand Canal, though the surviving evidence does not preserve every embankment and crossing in perfect detail. Its importance lies in what it reveals. Thonis-Heracleion was not merely beside water, it was built through water. The harbour basins were crowded working environments. Vessels waited at anchor, approached landing places, transferred cargo, or entered narrower routes suitable for local navigation. Quays and jetties controlled access to the shore. Wooden installations strengthened unstable waterfronts. Some structures may have supported pontoons or bridges across channels, allowing people to move between islands while boats passed nearby. The evidence remains incomplete, but the pattern suggests an urban fabric in which maritime and pedestrian movement were constantly intertwined. A merchant arriving from the Mediterranean would first experience the city as a sequence rather than a skyline. Shallow water and shifting channels demanded local knowledge. Anchoring grounds announced the approach before the temple buildings became clear. Officials, pilots, boatmen, labourers, and guards shaped the rhythm of arrival. Cargo might be inspected at one point, taxed at another, then transferred into smaller vessels capable of navigating the Nile's inland branches. The city's geography was a machine for slowing, sorting, and redirecting movement. This watery plan also explains why complete reconstruction is difficult. On modern maps, the city may appear as a clean arrangement of coloured islands, straight canals, temple walls, and harbour outlines. Such images are useful, but they are interpretations built from geophysical surveys, excavated trenches, artifact concentrations, and distorted remains. They are not aerial photographs of an intact metropolis. Some edges are secure, others remain hypothetical. Sediment has buried features unevenly, while subsidence and later disturbance have shifted the relation between structures. Even so, the broad organisation is unmistakable. The sacred centre occupied a commanding position within the network. Commercial facilities clustered around navigable water. Harbour installations were distributed according to depth, protection, and access. Channels connected not only one basin to another, but the Mediterranean threshold to the interior of Egypt. The city's form expressed its purpose. The materials used along the waterfront reveal constant negotiation with unstable ground. Stone created permanence where possible, but timber was essential. Wooden piles, planks, revetments, and reused hulls could reinforce banks or extend working surfaces into shallow water. Such installations demanded maintenance. Silt accumulated, posts decayed, floods altered pressure on embankments. A functioning port had to be repaired repeatedly, and the archaeological record preserves many phases rather than one construction plan. This makes Thonis-Heracleion less like a finished monument and more like a living organism. Channels could widen or narrow. Mooring zones could shift. A vessel past its useful life might become part of a quay. A landing place could be rebuilt over older timbers. Heavy temple blocks stood close to soft, saturated deposits. Every generation inherited a landscape already modified by those before it and altered it again. The division between sacred and practical space was less rigid than modern categories suggest. Boats carrying taxes or imported ceramics moved near waters used for offerings. Priests, customs officials, sailors, soldiers, and foreign merchants crossed the same embankments. Processions passed through a harbour landscape filled with routine labour. The temple did not stand apart from the port. Its authority was visible precisely where ships arrived and wealth entered Egypt. There must also have been sounds now absent beneath the bay, timber striking timber, ropes tightening against posts, shouted instructions, oars in narrow channels, jars set down on quays, and temple activity carrying across the water, smells of mud, fish, oil, incense, wet wood, grain, and foreign cargo mixed in the heat. The city was not a silent arrangement of stone. It was dense, damp, and noisy. Daily movement depended on timing. Tides here are modest, but wind, river flow, seasonal flooding, and sediment still affected navigation. A channel usable by one vessel might be dangerous for another. Flat-bottom craft could cross shallower routes that excluded seagoing ships. Pilots who understood local conditions possessed knowledge as valuable as any map. What survives in the record suggests that the port's success relied on human expertise as much as architecture. The city's island character may also have shaped social boundaries. Certain precincts could be entered only through controlled crossings. Warehouses and official areas may have been separated from residential or sacred zones by water. Yet scholars still debate the exact use of many mapped sectors, and reconstruction should not be mistaken for complete knowledge of neighbourhoods. Houses are less visible in the public story than temples and ships, partly because monumental and waterlogged remains are easier to identify than fragile traces of ordinary dwellings. One lesser-known clue comes from the distribution of anchors and wrecks. Their concentrations do more than indicate that ships were present. They help trace former harbour edges, zones of waiting, and navigable approaches. A cluster of anchors can mark repeated use over centuries, while buried hulls may preserve the line of a channel that later filled with sediment. Maritime debris becomes urban evidence. Seen this way, Thonis-Heracleion was a city whose map had to be read through movement. Its identity did not rest on a single avenue or defensive wall. It rested on connections, sea to river, ship to quay, canal to temple, island to island, foreign cargo to Egyptian administration. Water made those connections possible, but also made them fragile. The same channels that carried goods could silt up. The same saturated ground that supported quays could fail under weight. The same low islands that brought the city close to trade left it exposed to rising water and subsidence. Yet during its prosperity, these dangers were not the whole story. Water was first an advantage, and the city used that advantage with remarkable sophistication. As boats entered its basins, they crossed from open sea into a controlled economic landscape. The next layer of the city's story lies there, among cargo lists, customs rules, imported pottery, and royal decrees. The islands and canals formed the body of Thonis-Heracleion. Taxation and trade supplied its pulse. The islands and channels gave Thonis-Heracleion its physical form, but the city's deeper importance came from control. Ships did not simply arrive, unload, and disappear into Egypt. They entered a regulated threshold where royal authority, temple finance, and commercial necessity met. The port functioned as a customs station, a transfer point, and an administrative gate. Every amphora, timber, metal object, luxury item, and cargo of grain moved through a system designed to turn movement into revenue. The Decree of Sais makes that system unusually visible. Issued in the first year of Nechtnibaway, it ordered that 1/10 of certain revenues collected from goods entering through Thonis and from products passing through Naucratis be assigned to the Temple of Neith at Sais. The command was not a vague declaration of royal generosity. It defined a fiscal relationship between maritime trade, inland commerce, and a major religious institution. The stone stele stood where merchants and officials could see that taxation was not merely local practice. It was law backed by the king. This arrangement reveals how closely religion and administration were connected. A share of customs income supported a temple, while the decree itself was displayed in a sacred and commercial environment. Modern categories might separate state taxation from religious funding, but ancient Egypt did not divide power so neatly. Temples owned land, employed workers, received goods, and participated in economic networks. Royal legitimacy and divine order reinforced one another. At Thonis-Heracleion, the port's financial machinery helped sustain institutions far beyond the waterfront. The arrival of a foreign vessel was therefore a carefully managed event. Before cargo could move inland, its origin, quantity, and value had to be assessed. Officials recorded goods and calculated dues. Scribes worked with measures, seals, lists, and receipts. Guards controlled access to restricted areas. Interpreters and local intermediaries helped bridge languages and commercial customs. Boat crews waited while decisions were made. The process was probably frustrating in the timeless way that customs procedures often are, but delay was part of control. Large seagoing ships were not always suited to the shallow, shifting channels of the Nile Delta, Cargo could be transferred into smaller river craft with flatter bottoms and shallower drafts. Jars, sacks, crates, and raw materials moved from ship to quay, then from quay to another vessel. This transfer created work for porters, boatmen, warehouse keepers, inspectors, and contractors. The harbour's wealth did not come only from owning goods, it came from handling them. Imported pottery provides one of the clearest records of those connections. Ceramics from Corinth, Ionia, the Cyclades, Attica, Phoenicia, and Cyprus have been identified in the archaeological assemblage. Some vessels carried wine or oil, others arrived as tableware, storage containers, or specialized wares. Their shapes, fabrics, and manufacturing techniques allow archaeologists to trace regions of origin even when written labels are absent. A broken jar may appear insignificant beside a colossal statue, yet thousands of fragments reveal the roots that fed the port. Coins, weights, seals, and discarded packaging would have formed another layer of commercial life, though preservation is uneven. Much of the port's activity survives not as complete inventories, but as patterns reconstructed from scattered material. The trade was not one-directional. Egypt exported grain and other resources desired across the Mediterranean, while foreign merchants brought commodities that Egyptian consumers, elites, workshops, and institutions valued: metals, timber, wine, ceramics, and luxury goods entered a country rich in agricultural production, but dependent on wider networks for certain materials. The exact balance changed over time, and the evidence remains incomplete. But Thonis-Heracleion clearly occupied a strategic point between different economic worlds. It is tempting to describe the city as the single compulsory entrance for all foreign trade into Egypt. That claim is too broad. Its importance varied by period, political circumstances, and the condition of Nile branches. Naucratis was also a major commercial centre farther inland, and other routes existed. The decree itself links Thonis and Naucratis rather than erasing one in favour of the other. What survives suggests a network with specialised nodes. Not one port exercising permanent and absolute control over every cargo. Still, during its height from roughly the 6th through the 4th centuries BC, Thonis-Heracleion held an exceptional position. A ship approaching from the Greek world could reach the maritime gate, submit to Egyptian regulation, and enter a chain of transport extending deep into the delta. The city translated between sea and river, foreign and domestic systems, commercial ambition and royal oversight. Its prosperity came from being difficult to bypass. This role also explains the concentration of anchors and vessels around the harbour zones. Ships sometimes waited for clearance, favourable conditions, pilots, or available berths. Delays could last long enough for crews to repair equipment, purchase supplies, or interact with local markets. The port was not merely a point crossed in a few hours. For many visitors, it was their first sustained encounter with Egypt. The city's officials must have dealt with constant uncertainty. Cargo could be concealed, measures could be disputed, weather could damage goods before inspection, channels could become obstructed, political changes could alter tariff rules or the status of foreign communities. No single document preserves the daily routine in full, and scholars still debate how specific administrative spaces were arranged. Yet the combination of decrees, pottery, harbour installations, and transport evidence shows that regulation was embedded in the city's design. There was also a symbolic dimension to taxation at the river mouth. Foreign wealth became Egyptian revenue at the moment of entry. By assigning part of that income to Neith, the king transformed commerce into an offering within the divine order. A merchant may have viewed the payment as an unavoidable cost. The state presented it as part of the proper structure of the kingdom. The decree of sale is especially valuable because it gives the lost city a working voice. Monumental statues communicate power, but they rarely explain procedure. The stele tells us that goods were assessed, revenues divided, and institutional beneficiaries named. It turns the harbour from a picturesque setting into an administrative machine. Around that machine moved people whose identities are mostly lost scribes bending over records, labourers shifting jars, pilots reading water, guards watching entrances, merchants calculating profit, and priests receiving the distant benefit of customs income. Their work made the city function long before any temple block fell or any statue disappeared beneath the bay. Yet commerce did more than enrich institutions. It brought different communities into prolonged contact. Foreigners did not only pass through, some stayed, worshipped, served, traded, and built relationships within an Egyptian-controlled port. The customs gate filtered goods, but it could not prevent ideas, rituals, languages, and identities from moving with them. Beyond the ledgers and quays, Thonis-Heracleion was becoming a place where Egyptian and Greek lives occupied the same narrow islands. The customs house could regulate cargo, but it could not keep the port culturally sealed. Every vessel brought more than amphora, timber, metal, or wine. It brought accents, habits, gods, clothing, recipes, loyalties, and expectations. At Thonis-Heracleion, Egyptians and Greeks did not meet in an abstract border zone. They worked within the same harbours, crossed the same bridges, waited beside the same warehouses, and moved through a city whose sacred landscape remained unmistakably Egyptian, even as foreign communities established their own places of worship. The clearest recent evidence came from the 2023 campaign east of the great sanctuary of Amun-Gereb. There, archaeologists identified a Greek sacred area dedicated to Aphrodite. Imported ceramics and bronze objects appeared alongside offerings connected with Greek religious practice. The discovery did not transform the city into a Greek colony, nor did it weaken the authority of the Egyptian state. Instead, it revealed a more complicated port society. Foreign residents and visitors could maintain recognizable traditions inside a city controlled through Egyptian institutions, royal decrees, and temple power. Aphrodite was an appropriate presence in a harbour. Across the Greek world, she could be associated not only with beauty and desire, but also with seafaring, safe passage, and the uncertain fortunes of people who lived by ships. A merchant or sailor entering the Nile after a difficult crossing might offer thanks or ask for protection before departing again. The exact rituals performed at this sanctuary remain uncertain, but its position within the port gave it practical as well as religious meaning. The finds also included Greek weapons, which the excavation team has linked with mercenaries assigned to defend the approaches to the kingdom. Egyptian rulers had long employed foreign soldiers, and Greek mercenaries became especially visible during the first millennium BC. At a strategic river mouth, such troops could guard customs facilities, monitor ships, and protect the harbour against attack or smuggling. Yet a weapon does not preserve the biography of the person who carried it. Some may have belonged to soldiers, others could have reached the sanctuary through dedication, storage, loss, or later disturbance. The interpretation is persuasive, but the evidence remains incomplete. The Greek presence was therefore neither accidental nor purely commercial. People from the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean lived long enough in the region to establish religious spaces, import familiar objects, and serve within military and trading networks. Their community was embedded in an Egyptian city rather than standing outside it. A Greek merchant could pay duties under a decree issued by an Egyptian king, hire local boatmen, worship at a sanctuary of Aphrodite, and conduct business beneath the monumental authority of Amun-Gereb. This coexistence should not be romanticized. Archaeology can demonstrate proximity, exchange, and shared space more readily than perfect harmony. The existence of two religious traditions in one city does not prove equal status or the absence of conflict. Egyptian officials controlled the gate. Foreign merchants depended on permission, contracts, and local intermediaries. Soldiers occupied a different social position from traders, and wealthy residents experienced the port differently from labourers carrying cargo on wet quays. Scholars still debate how communities were organised and how sharply ethnic identities were maintained in daily life. Material culture suggests both separation and blending. Imported pottery allowed foreign residents to eat, drink, and store goods in familiar ways. Egyptian objects circulated through the same neighbourhoods. Religious dedications could preserve distinct divine names while adapting to local settings. Personal names, artistic styles, and workshop practices sometimes crossed boundaries that official categories tried to keep clear. A port encourages such mixing because practical cooperation is unavoidable. Ships need pilots, merchants need interpreters, officials need reliable agents, households need food, tools, and labour regardless of origin. Language must have been heard everywhere. Egyptian speech dominated administration and local life, while Greek served merchants, soldiers, and visitors from abroad. Some inhabitants likely understood both. Written texts were more formal, but spoken communication depended on flexibility, gestures, repeated transactions, and people skilled at translation. Misunderstandings were inevitable, so were new expressions and borrowed terms. None of this survives as sound. Yet the bilingual identity of the city is written into its two names. The sanctuary of Aphrodite also changes the emotional texture of the ruins. The city is often presented through colossal statues and royal inscriptions, objects designed to endure. A smaller sacred area brings attention to private uncertainty. People offered objects because voyages were dangerous, fortunes unstable, health fragile, and separation from home difficult. The offerings may have represented gratitude, fear, obligation, or hope. Their makers rarely left names, but their choices reveal what mattered to them. Nearby, the Egyptian sanctuary expressed power on a far larger scale. Amun-Gereb was tied to kingship, dynastic legitimacy, and ceremonies performed for the state. Aphrodite's sacred area existed within the shadow of that authority. The contrast did not necessarily imply opposition. Ancient polytheistic societies could accommodate multiple cults without demanding exclusive belief. A person might participate in more than one ritual world, especially in a port where divine identities were compared and translated across cultures. Even Heracles, whose Greek name shaped Heracleion, reflected this process. Greek visitors associated the local sacred landscape with their own hero god, while Egyptians understood the city through Amun-Gereb and other native traditions. Such identifications were never exact. They were bridges of interpretation, ways to make an unfamiliar religious world intelligible without making it identical to home. The 2023 discoveries are important precisely because they resist a simple story. They do not show Greeks replacing Egyptians, nor an isolated foreign quarter floating outside local society. They show a controlled Egyptian gateway containing a durable Greek religious presence, imported goods, and probable military activity. The port's cosmopolitan character was real, but it existed within unequal structures of authority. At ground level, those structures were experienced through ordinary encounters. A sailor asked directions from a local boatman. A trader negotiated storage. A guard inspected a vessel. A priest received an offering made in a foreign style. A craft worker copied an imported form using local material. Each transaction left little trace, but together they created the city's social fabric. Water kept these communities close. Islands and canals compressed movement into bridges, quays, landing places, and boats. People who might have lived apart still met at the same crossings. The harbour was a place of difference, cooperation, suspicion, opportunity, and adaptation, all at once. Above these encounters rose the sanctuary of Amun-Gereb. Its walls did more than dominate the skyline. They connected the port's wealth and diversity to the authority of the Egyptian crown. Foreign gods could find a place in Thonis-Heracleion, but the city's sacred centre proclaimed who controlled the gateway. To understand that control fully, the temple must be approached not merely as a building, but as a place where divine approval could help make a ruler legitimate. The sanctuary of Amun-Gereb stood at the centre of the port like a statement carved into the landscape. Ships entered through channels governed by Egyptian officials. Foreign merchants passed through customs. Greek worshippers maintained their own sacred spaces. And yet the largest concentration of ritual power belonged to a god whose authority reached far beyond the city. The temple was not simply one monument among many. It linked the maritime gateway to the ideology of kingship itself. Amun-Gereb was a local form of Amun, one of the most powerful deities in the Egyptian religious world. By the 1st millennium BC, Amun was associated with hidden power, creation, divine sovereignty, and the legitimacy of rulers. In Thonis-Heracleion, that authority was expressed where the sea opened into Egypt. The geography was almost too perfect for symbolism. A king who controlled the river mouth controlled movement, revenue, defense, and access. A god who confirmed the king's right to rule transformed that control into something sacred. The excavation team interprets the sanctuary as a place where pharaohs received titles and ritual confirmation from Amun-Gereb. This should not be simplified into the claim that every ruler of Egypt was crowned here. The surviving evidence does not provide a complete list of coronations, nor does it show that the city replaced the kingdom's other ceremonial centres. What it does suggest is that rites performed in the temple could affirm universal authority and dynastic legitimacy, especially for rulers who needed to demonstrate that they stood within the ancient order of Egypt. That need became particularly important under the Ptolemies, after Alexander the Great entered Egypt and Alexandria was founded in 331 BC. A Macedonian dynasty eventually ruled a population whose political traditions were thousands of years old. The Ptolemies spoke Greek, governed through a court shaped by the Hellenistic world, and competed with other successor kingdoms across the eastern Mediterranean. Yet inside Egypt they also appeared as pharaohs. They adopted Egyptian titulary, supported temples, commissioned reliefs in traditional style, and presented themselves as participants in divine kingship rather than foreign occupiers. Thonis-Heracleion offered an ideal stage for that performance. It was internationally visible and deeply embedded in Egyptian ritual geography. Foreign ships and Greek communities occupied a port whose central sanctuary remained under Egyptian priestly authority. A Ptolemaic ruler appearing before Amun-Gereb could address multiple audiences at once. To Greek observers, he remained a Hellenistic monarch governing a strategic harbour. To Egyptian institutions, he enacted the duties of a pharaoh receiving divine recognition. The gold plaque from the reign of Ptolemy III belongs to this political and religious world. Its inscription concerning a sacred building shows royal investment in the sanctuary. But a small object should not carry more certainty than it can bear. It does not preserve an entire ceremony or explain every ritual performed there. Instead, it joins a wider body of evidence showing that the Ptolemies maintained and reshaped the temple complex, using traditional forms of devotion to secure continuity between their rule and Egypt's sacred past. The temple's position also made ceremony visible to the city. Monumental architecture rose above low islands and harbour installations. Colossal statues represented rulers, gods, and royal consorts at a scale intended to overwhelm ordinary proportions. Processional spaces connected buildings with water, offerings accumulated in channels and basins. The port's commercial noise did not stop at the sanctuary boundary. It surrounded it, making divine authority part of the daily experience of arrival. A merchant waiting for cargo inspection did not need to understand the subtleties of Egyptian theology to recognize power. Stone walls, towering figures, controlled entrances, priestly activity, and royal inscriptions made the message clear. This gateway belonged to a kingdom protected by gods and administered in their name. The temple turned the practical fact of border control into a cosmic arrangement. The 2023 excavations in the Southern Canal brought this sacred machinery into sharper focus. Divers recovered ritual objects made from silver, gold, alabaster, and other materials in the area associated with the Amun sanctuary. These finds survived beneath collapsed architectural blocks and sediment, preserving traces of ceremonies that once depended on movement through the temple and along the water. They reveal the wealth, skill, and attention directed toward ritual performance. Some objects may have been offerings, others may have formed part of temple equipment or ceremonial storage. Their exact use is not always certain, especially when buildings collapse and objects move into canals. Underwater context can preserve remarkable assemblages, but it can also blend moments separated by time. No single explanation fully accounts for every object found near the sanctuary. Archaeologists must distinguish deliberate deposition from accidental loss, structural destruction, and later displacement. The temple itself changed across generations. Walls were repaired, sacred furnishings replaced, and political patrons came and went. Egyptian kings of the late period, followed by Ptolemaic rulers, left different marks on the precinct. What modern maps call the Temple of Amun-Gereb was not frozen in one perfect phase. It was rebuilt and reinterpreted as dynasties changed. Even while its central claim endured legitimate rule required divine recognition. This continuity helps explain why the sanctuary remained important after Alexandria transformed the economic balance of the coast. Ports may lose commercial dominance more quickly than temples lose sacred authority. A harbour can be bypassed, but a ritual landscape carries memory, accumulated offerings, priestly institutions, and traditions tied to place. Thonis-Heracleion's role as an international gateway weakened over time, yet its religious life did not end the moment a newer city rose on the horizon. Egypt's rulers governed not only land but entrances. The sea represented opportunity and danger trade, invasion, diplomacy, Migration, piracy, and foreign influence all came through it. By receiving confirmation from Amun at the edge of the delta, a ruler symbolically mastered the unstable boundary between Egypt and the outside world. The paradox is that the sanctuary proclaimed permanence while standing on ground that was anything but permanent. Colossal blocks pressed into waterlogged sediment. Canals ran beside foundations. Flooding, compaction, and shifting soils worked beneath architecture designed to embody eternal order. Priests could restore walls and rulers could renew inscriptions, but neither could make the delta stop moving. Still, for centuries, the temple succeeded in its purpose. It made authority visible. It bound foreign traffic to Egyptian sovereignty. It allowed rulers, including the Ptolemies, to enter a ritual language older than their dynasty. And it transformed the port from a customs station into a sacred threshold. The next great movement through that threshold did not center on a living king. It belonged to Osiris, the god whose death and renewal shaped one of Egypt's most powerful ritual traditions. From the waters around Amun-Gereb, sacred vessels carried divine presence toward nearby Canopus, turning the channels between two cities into a ceremonial path across the dark surface of the delta. The royal ceremonies of Amun-Gereb gave Thonis-Heracleion gravity, but another ritual transformed the surrounding waters into something more intimate and mysterious. At certain moments in the sacred calendar, the canals were not merely routes for trade and taxation. They became a stage for the mysteries of Osiris, ceremonies centered on death, restoration, and the promise that order could return after destruction. The god moved across water, and Thonis-Heracleion and Canopus became linked by a sacred journey. Osiris was among the most enduring figures in Egyptian religion. He was the murdered king restored through divine power, ruler of the dead, and a symbol of renewal tied to kingship and fertility. His mysteries were not public performances, and the surviving evidence does not preserve every action, prayer, or restricted rite. Much remains unknown because sacred knowledge was selective. Rituals changed over time, and archaeology usually recovers objects rather than the meanings attached to them. Yet what survives suggests that water was central. From the sanctuary zone of Amun-Gereb, a ritual image or sacred form of Osiris was carried by boat toward Canopus. The route connected two separate cities, not two names for one place. Thonis-Heracleion served as the point of departure within a landscape of temples, canals, and harbour basins, while Canopus formed another sacred destination. Between them stretched waterways that had commercial functions on ordinary days, but could be transformed by ceremony into a path of divine passage. The journey must have changed the atmosphere of the port. Mooring areas, embankments, and canals familiar to sailors and labourers became part of the ritual geography. Priests handled sacred objects. Boats moved in procession. Participants watched from banks, bridges, quays, and vessels. Lamps reflected on dark water. Incense and oil smoke drifted above channels usually filled with the smell of mud, rope, cargo, and wet timber. The same city that taxed foreign merchandise also carried a dead god through the night. The most striking evidence for this watery ritual world comes from hundreds of small lead boats recovered around the temple and its channels. Many measure between roughly 12 and 67 centimetres, though some are larger. They are not crude toys. They reproduce elements of boats in miniature and sometimes carry small thrones, shrines, lamps. Their scale made them manageable as offerings, but their form connected them directly to sacred vessels used in ceremony. Lead was a practical material for such objects, It could be cast, shaped, and weighted. In water, it sank quickly and remained close to where it was deposited, though currents, sediment movement, and collapse could disturb its context. The survival of these vessels is partly a result of the same conditions that destroyed the city. Water buried them, mud sealed them, and the sunken landscape protected details that might not have endured on land. Some boats appear to have been placed deliberately into canals or basins as votive gifts. Others was buried beneath stone slabs, an action difficult to explain as casual disposal. Their deposition suggests controlled ritual behavior rather than random loss. A miniature boat may have represented participation in the divine journey, a prayer for renewal, an offering made for a household, or a material substitute for a larger vessel. Scholars still debate the precise meanings, and no single explanation fully accounts for every example. The tiny thrones found on some boats deepen the mystery. An empty throne could signify divine presence without depicting the god directly. It might have carried a small image or sacred emblem now lost. The absence of a surviving figure does not necessarily mean the boat was incomplete. In Egyptian ritual, presence could be expressed through symbols, containers, standards, and prepared spaces. A throne on a miniature vessel may have marked the boat as more than a model. It became a portable sacred setting. Lead lamps found in the same ritual environment offer another clue. Their flames would have been small, but multiplied across water they could create a moving field of light. Whether every lamp was used during the Osirian ceremonies cannot be proven, yet their association with votive deposits and waterways makes the connection plausible. Darkness mattered in a cult concerned with death and rebirth. A procession illuminated by lamps could turn the journey toward Canopus into an enactment of life emerging from obscurity. The ritual was not detached from kingship. Osiris was the dead ruler whose son Horus restored legitimate order, and every pharaoh was symbolically connected to that cycle. Amun-Gereb confirmed authority. Osiris expressed the continuity of rule beyond death. In Thonis-Heracleion, these traditions met at a gateway where political power, foreign trade, and sacred geography overlapped. The city did not merely protect Egypt from the sea, it helped renew the cosmic order on which the kingdom claimed to depend. For ordinary residents, the mysteries may have offered meanings beyond royal ideology. Osiris spoke to fears shared across social boundaries, mortality, loss, uncertain harvests, and the desire that life continue in another form. A harbour population understood uncertainty intimately. Ships failed to return. Storms interrupted journeys. Trade fortunes rose and collapsed. The river nourished fields and could erase boundaries. A god restored after dismemberment belonged naturally in a city where survival depended on unstable water. The procession also reveals how closely Thonis-Heracleion and Canopus were connected without being identical. Commercial routes joined them, but ritual created a deeper bond. Sacred movement turned geography into narrative. The departure from one city and arrival at another mirrored a passage from death toward renewal, from fragmentation toward restored order. Water did not separate the two sacred centers, it made the relationship possible. Later, when both cities disappeared beneath or beside the bay, the route itself was lost, channels shifted, islands subsided, and the processional landscape became unreadable from the surface. Yet the miniature boats remained below, clustered where participants had placed them. Their survival is one of the quietest marvels of the site. Monumental statues announce rulers and gods in stone, but these vessels preserve repeated acts by people whose names are unknown. They also warn against treating every object in a harbour as commercial debris. A boat can carry cargo, serve as a ferry, become part of a quay, be abandoned at the end of its working life, or enter the archaeological record as a deliberate offering. Context determines meaning. At Thonis-Heracleion, the waters were crowded with all of these possibilities. The sacred boats point toward a larger maritime record surrounding the city. Beyond the votive vessels lay real hulls, anchors, mooring zones, and timbers from working ships. Some sank by accident, some were discarded, some were reused in construction. Others may have entered the water through ritual action. The port was not only a place where vessels arrived, it became, over centuries, a vast archive of boats and the many ways a city could use them. The miniature boats of Osiris reveal one way vessels entered the sacred record, but the waters around Thonis-Heracleion preserve a much larger and more complicated maritime archive. Across the mapped harbour zones, researchers have identified more than 700 anchors and roughly 125 shipwrecks. Those figures are far higher than the totals reported in earlier stages of the project, when surveys had located more than 60 or 70 wrecks. The difference does not mean the old accounts were wrong. It reflects a landscape still being mapped, where each new campaign expands the number of known vessels, mooring points, and buried structures. Each published total is therefore a snapshot of ongoing work, not a final census of every hull concealed beneath the sediment of the bay. At first glance, such a concentration looks like evidence for catastrophe. A city sinks, a harbour collapses, and an entire fleet appears to have gone down with it. That image is dramatic, but it does not fit the archaeological contexts. The assemblage accumulated over centuries. Ships reached the seabed for different reasons, at different times, and under very different circumstances. Some were genuine wrecks. Others were abandoned after their working lives ended. Some were dismantled or reused as waterfront structures. A few may have been deposited for ritual purposes. The harbour was less a single disaster scene than a layered record of how a maritime city consumed, repaired, discarded, and transformed its vessels. Accidental loss certainly occurred. Shallow channels, shifting bars, storms, collisions, overloaded hulls, and unstable banks created constant danger. A vessel could strike the bottom, take on water, or be driven against a quay. Fire, structural failure, and poor maintenance added other risks. Yet even when a ship sank unexpectedly, its final position might later be altered. Salvagers removed cargo, fittings, and useful timbers. Currents moved lighter objects. Sediment covered one side while leaving another exposed. Heavy architectural collapse could crush or bury the hull long after the original wrecking event. Other vessels reached the bottom with far less drama. Wooden ships had finite lives. Planks decayed, joints loosened, and repairs eventually cost more than replacement. A worn hull could be left in a quiet basin or along a bank, where it slowly filled with mud. Abandonment was not necessarily careless. Old vessels could be stripped of valuable parts first, then allowed to settle in places where they would not obstruct navigation. The remaining structure might preserve enough form for archaeologists to identify construction methods centuries later. Some hulls were deliberately reused. In a city built on soft, wet ground, timber was always useful. An obsolete boat could become part of a quay, revetment, landing platform, or bank reinforcement. Its curved body might be filled with sediment and pinned into place. Planks could be removed and inserted into another structure. Such reuse blurs the line between shipwreck and architecture. What appears on a survey map as a buried vessel may have entered the ground not through failure, but through practical engineering. Ritual deposition adds another possibility. The votive boats around the Amun precinct prove that watercraft carried sacred meaning. Full-sized vessels may also have been placed or abandoned in ceremonial contexts, although such interpretations demand caution. A ship found near a temple is not automatically an offering. Its orientation, associated objects, construction history, and relation to surrounding features must all be considered. Scholars still debate several cases because the evidence remains incomplete, and ordinary abandonment can sometimes resemble deliberate placement. Anchors present the same interpretive challenge. A harbour with more than 700 anchors did not necessarily suffer 700 emergencies. Anchors were lost when ropes broke, abandoned when they became trapped, left with vessels, stored near quays, or reused in construction. Their distribution helps reconstruct ancient mooring areas and navigable approaches, but only when considered together with depth, sediment, harbour walls, and wreck positions. A dense cluster may mark a popular anchorage used repeatedly rather than a single destructive event. The anchors also record technological variety. Stone anchors, composite forms, and wooden examples belong to different vessel types and periods. In 2025, the project published a specialized study of 2 one-armed wooden anchors from Sector G8. Their archaeological context, including associated pottery, points to a date between approximately 480 and 420 BC. The publication is recent, but that does not necessarily mean the anchors were discovered during a 2025 excavation season. Archaeological analysis often appears years after recovery, once conservation, recording, comparison, and dating have been completed. A one-armed wooden anchor looks deceptively simple. Its timber body and projecting arm were designed to catch the seabed, while added weight helped it descend and hold. Organic materials rarely survive well in open marine settings, but the waterlogged and sediment-rich conditions of Aboukir Bay protected wood that would normally decay. Such finds reveal details of maritime technology that stone and metal alone cannot preserve. Tool marks, joinery, timber choice, and wear may show how an anchor was made, used, repaired, and finally lost or discarded. The Sector G8 anchors also belong to the city's period of greatest prosperity, when Thonis-Heracleion handled intense traffic between Egypt and the Mediterranean. Their dates overlap with the age of Herodotus and with the expansion of Greek commercial activity in the delta. They are modest objects compared with colossal statues, yet they bring the harbour closer to ordinary work. Someone selected the wood, shaped the arm, secured the components, checked the rope, and relied on the device to keep a vessel from drifting into danger. The wrecks offer similar human traces. Hull repairs reveal repeated efforts to extend a ship's usefulness. Different woods may indicate access to local and imported resources. Construction choices reflect the demands of shallow water, cargo capacity, and river navigation. Damage can show where stress accumulated. Even the absence of valuable fittings suggests salvage by people who knew exactly which parts could be reused. No single explanation fully accounts for the ship assemblage, because a working port produces many kinds of maritime remains. That complexity is scientifically more valuable than the image of one drowned fleet. It allows archaeologists to study harbour management, shipbuilding, maintenance, abandonment, ritual behaviour, and environmental change across generations. The seabed around Thonis-Heracleion is therefore not a cemetery in the simple sense. It is a palimpsest of movement. Ships arrived, waited, unloaded, crossed into the delta, returned to sea, broke apart, were repaired, repurposed, lost, or offered. Their final positions preserve fragments of those different histories. Among them lies one vessel whose importance reaches beyond the city itself. Its timbers closely match a type of Egyptian boat described by Herodotus in unusual technical detail. Known as Ship 17, it would turn an ancient passage once treated with suspicion into one of the most remarkable conversations between text and archaeology ever recovered from the mud. The timbers of Ship 17 were not impressive because they belonged to a royal barge or a vessel loaded with treasure. Their importance came from something quieter. They seemed to answer a technical description written more than 2,000 years earlier by Herodotus, the same author whose stories had preserved the name of the lost port. In the second book of his histories, he described an Egyptian cargo vessel called a baris. For generations, scholars debated what kind of craft he meant and whether his account could be trusted. Then a large wreck emerged from the mud of Thonis-Heracleion, and the ancient description suddenly acquired planks, joints, dimensions, and weight. And Ship 17 dates broadly from the early 5th to the middle of the 4th century BC. Reconstructed, it measured about 28 meters long and 8 meters wide. Most of its surviving structure was made from acacia, a timber widely used in Egypt because it was locally available and strong. The hull had a broad, relatively flat bottom, well adapted to shallow water and the shifting channels of the Nile delta. It was built for a world where depth could change quickly and where a vessel needed capacity without drawing too much water. Herodotus described the planks of a baris as being arranged in a manner resembling courses of bricks. That comparison once sounded obscure. Ship 17 made it intelligible. Its hull used short, thick planks laid in staggered rows rather than long continuous strakes familiar from many Mediterranean ships. Seen from the side, the pattern could indeed resemble brickwork. It concerns one of the most distinctive features of the construction. The planks were held together by long internal fastenings that passed through multiple timbers. Herodotus wrote of long tenons driven through the boards, and the wreck preserves a related system of elongated wooden connectors, locking the short planks into a coherent hull. The precise translation of his terminology remains debated, and Ship 17 does not reproduce every phrase without ambiguity. Still, the structural correspondence is remarkable. An ancient observer had noticed the same unusual technique that archaeologists later measured in the submerged vessel. He also emphasized acacia wood. In Egypt, long straight timbers were difficult to obtain compared with regions rich in tall forest trees. Builders adapted by using shorter pieces and joining them with extraordinary skill. The baris construction was not an inferior imitation of Mediterranean shipbuilding. It was a solution to local materials, river conditions, and transport needs. Ship 17 shows a tradition engineered around what Egypt possessed and where Egyptian boats had to travel. The vessel's steering system provides another striking connection. Herodotus described a steering oar passing through the keel or lower part of the hull. Ship 17 appears to have used a central steering arrangement involving an aperture near the stern, rather than paired side rudders common in many ancient images. The exact operation is reconstructed from incomplete remains, but the design again places the wreck close to the baris described in the text. Even its proportions fit a cargo carrier suited to inland and delta navigation. A flat floor created useful storage space. The broad beam offered stability. The vessel could move heavy loads through shallow water, linking maritime ports with river routes farther inland. It may have transported goods unloaded from seagoing ships at Thonis-Heracleion, carrying them across the delta or toward major markets. Its working life belonged to the transfer system that made the city economically powerful. The match does not prove that Herodotus was always accurate. That claim would turn one archaeological success into a defense of every story and marvel in his work. Ancient authors relied on observation, interpreters, local informants, memory, and literary convention. They could preserve precise technical information in one passage and repeat doubtful material in another. Ship 17 shows that his description of the Baris was grounded in a real Egyptian shipbuilding tradition. It does not certify the entire histories. There are also qualifications within the comparison. Scholars still debate particular Greek terms, the reconstruction of the steering mechanism, and whether Ship 17 represents the exact type Herodotus saw or a related member of a broader tradition. The wreck spans a date range compatible with his lifetime, but there is no reason to imagine that he stood beside this specific hull. Its survival gives that continuity a rare physical form today. That restraint makes the discovery more compelling, not less. Archaeology rarely provides a perfect illustration of an ancient paragraph. Here, separate details converge: acacia timber, short planks in staggered rows, long internal fastenings, a broad, shallow water hull, and an unusual steering arrangement. Each feature might be explained alone. Together, they make coincidence increasingly unlikely. Ship 17 also restores a category of expertise often hidden behind monumental history. Egyptian shipwrights understood stress, buoyancy, timber behavior, cargo distribution, and the demands of river channels. They worked without modern drawings, yet produced a vessel nearly 30 meters long from short pieces of wood. The hull depended on precise shaping and repeated joints. A small error multiplied across hundreds of components could weaken the entire structure. Construction required experienced teams, standardized practices, and knowledge passed across generations. The ship's remains preserve repair and use, not merely original design. Working vessels flexed under cargo and current. Planks wore down, fastenings loosened, water entered seams. Crews maintained hulls because a boat represented a major investment. A repaired timber records a decision that the vessel remained worth saving. Such details bring Ship 17 closer to the labouring city than to royal display. Its discovery also shows why the mud of Aboukir Bay matters. Stone survives in many environments, but waterlogged wood usually disappears once exposed to oxygen and biological decay, buried beneath sediment. Ship 17 retained structural information that would otherwise have vanished. Excavation therefore had to proceed slowly, with detailed recording and conservation planning. A wooden wreck can be destroyed by careless recovery even after surviving underwater for millennia. There is an almost perfect symmetry in the find. Herodotus helped keep Heracleion alive in written memory, though his account mixed history with legend. The city, once located, returned a vessel that clarified one of his most technical observations. Text led researchers toward the submerged landscape, and the submerged landscape answered the text. Yet Ship 17 was still a working object made by anonymous hands. Its builders left no names, its crew left no diary. The cargoes it carried are uncertain. Like most people who sustained Thonis-Heracleion, those connected with the vessel survive through traces of touch and technique rather than biography. In the next layer of the city's record, even that touch becomes visible. on small terracotta figurines. Fingerprints pressed into wet clay preserve the ridges of the people who made them, returning ordinary labour to a story long dominated by gods, kings, and ships. The colossal statues of Thonis-Heracleion were made to outlast human lives. The fingerprints pressed into its terracotta figurines were not. They were accidental, minute, and almost certainly never intended to be seen. Yet after more than 2,000 years beneath Aboukir Bay, those faint ridges bring the city's anonymous workers closer than many royal monuments can. A ruler's name survives because it was carved deliberately. A craft worker survives because a fingertip touched damp clay before it hardened. The evidence comes from a study of 16 terracotta figurines recovered from the submerged city. Their surfaces preserve traces of production. Clay was pressed into moulds, removed, joined, adjusted, and finished by hand. During those stages, fingers left impressions in places sometimes hidden from view along interiors, seams, backs, and surfaces later covered by additional pieces. Once the clay dried and was fired, those marks became fixed. To examine them, researcher Leonie Hoff used reflectance transformation imaging, or RTI. The method photographs an object repeatedly while light falls across it from different directions. Specialized software then allows the surface to be viewed under changing virtual illumination. Shallow impressions difficult to see under ordinary light become clearer as highlights and shadows move across them. Researchers compare features such as ridge breadth and density because these can, with caution, offer estimates about the biological characteristics of the person who left the print. Statistical patterns in modern and archaeological samples suggest differences that may relate to age and sex. Although overlap between individuals is substantial, the method cannot identify a named person, establish a precise age, or turn a partial print into a biography. It produces probabilities, not portraits. The preliminary results suggest that figurine production involved a varied group of workers rather than one uniform class of adult male specialists. Prints consistent with men, women, and younger artisans appear on the small sample. Some impressions were left while clay was pressed into moulds. Others occur near joins, where separately formed sections were assembled. The distribution may indicate that different hands perform different stages, with some workers handling repetitive moulding and others completing more complex assembly. That possibility opens a workshop door normally closed to archaeology. A figurine may have passed from one person to another before firing. One worker prepared clay, another forced it into a mould. Someone else removed the form, trimmed excess material, attached a head or limb, and smoothed the seam. Paint or surface treatment may have followed. The object was the result of a sequence, and the fingerprints preserve moments within it. The sample, however, consists of only 16 figurines. It cannot represent every workshop, neighbourhood, period, or form of labour in Thonis-Heracleion. Ridge measurements can be affected by pressure, angle, clay consistency, shrinkage during firing, preservation, and incomplete prints. Biological estimates based on modern comparative data must be applied carefully to ancient populations. Scholars still debate how confidently sex and age categories can be inferred from fragmentary impressions. The study is valuable because it opens a line of inquiry, not because it settles the organization of the city's entire craft economy. Even with those limits, the marks challenge the way submerged cities are often narrated. Grand discoveries naturally attract attention. A colossal king lifted from sediment, a decree that resolves a historical puzzle, a ship whose construction matches Herodotus. Such objects reveal institutions and technologies, but they can make the ancient population seem like a background crowd. Fingerprints reverse the scale. They begin with the body of an unknown worker and expand outward toward the workshop, household, market, and religious practices that gave a figurine meaning. Terracotta figures could serve many purposes. Some represented deities, worshippers, animals, musicians, or protective beings. They might be placed in sanctuaries, kept in homes, carried as personal objects, or offered during rituals. The precise use of each example depends on its form and context, and many meanings remain uncertain. What is clear is that these objects belong to a world beyond royal ceremony. They were affordable and reproducible in ways monumental stone sculpture was not. Mold production allowed workshops to make similar figures repeatedly, while still leaving small variations created by individual hands. A fingerprint on the inside of a figurine is especially intimate because no buyer or worshipper was expected to inspect it. It was not a signature, and the worker may not have noticed it. The impression record's pressure applied on one ordinary day, perhaps in a workshop close enough to the harbour for wet clay, fuel, finished goods, and customers to move by boat. The city's multicultural setting may also have shaped production. Egyptian and Greek religious forms circulated through the port. Imported objects provided models, while local workshops adapted styles to available materials and local demand. A figurine could combine a familiar manufacturing method with imagery understood differently by different communities. Yet fingerprints do not reveal the language or ancestry of the maker. They resist the temptation to assign every hand neatly to an ethnic category. They show shared labour more clearly than identity. The workshop itself has not survived as a complete room with workers fixed at their tasks. Kilns, moulds, clay sources, tools, and discarded failures must be reconstructed from scattered evidence. Some figurines may have been made elsewhere and imported. Others likely came from local production. The fingerprint study helps distinguish stages of manufacture, but no single explanation fully accounts for how all terracottas reached the city or who controlled their sale. Still, the surviving ridges create a form of contact across time. They are direct impressions of skin. The spacing of lines reflects a real fingertip. The smudge of a join reflects a real adjustment. Unlike a written decree, they do not speak in the voice of authority. Unlike a statue, they do not idealize the body. They preserve work. That work sustained the visible world of Thonis-Heracleion. Priests required offerings. Merchants needed containers and household goods. Sailors purchased protective objects. Families furnished domestic shrines. Workshops depended on clay, water, fuel, moulds, and access to customers. Behind every sacred procession and customs payment stood countless acts of making, carrying, repairing, cooking, recording, and cleaning that rarely entered formal history. By the time these figurines were studied in 2024, this city had been known to modern archaeology for nearly a quarter of a century. Yet the smallest marks were still producing new questions. Rediscovery was not moving only outward across the seabed, it was moving inward, from maps and monuments toward individuals. Those individuals lived through changes larger than any workshop. New rulers arrived. Trade routes shifted. Alexandria rose to the west and drew maritime power toward its planned harbours. Thonis-Heracleion did not fall silent at once. But the economic world that had made it indispensable began to reorganize. The fingerprints remained in clay while the balance of the Mediterranean coast moved elsewhere. Alexandria did not kill Thonis-Heracleion in a single stroke. It changed the direction of history around it. When Alexander the Great founded his new city on Egypt's Mediterranean coast in 331 BC, the old port at the Canopic mouth still possessed temples, officials, ships, warehouses, and generations of accumulated importance. Its channels did not empty overnight. Merchants did not wake the next morning and abandon every quay. Yet a powerful alternative had appeared to the west, planned for maritime traffic and tied to a new imperial order. Alexandria occupied a different kind of position. It faced the Mediterranean with broad harbours, a monumental urban plan, and the political prestige of Alexander's name. Under the Ptolemies, it became the royal capital, administrative centre, intellectual showcase, and international port of Egypt. Investment, population, naval power, and trade concentrated there. Routes that had once made Thonis-Heracleion indispensable could now be redirected through a city designed to command both the sea and the kingdom. The shift was gradual because ports are not interchangeable pieces on a board. Thonis-Heracleion retained advantages rooted in local knowledge, established temple estates, river connections, and familiar commercial practice. Pilots knew its channels, officials understood its custom system, priests maintained rituals that could not simply be moved without altering their meaning. Traders had relationships with local agents and warehouses. Even as Alexandria expanded, the older city continued to serve regional, religious, and perhaps specialized commercial functions. Archaeology confirms continued activity during the Ptolemaic period and into Roman times. Buildings were repaired or modified. Offerings were deposited. Ceramics and coins show that people still used the site after its economic peak had passed. The sanctuary of Amun-Gereb remained significant, while ceremonies connected with Osiris continued to bind the city to nearby Canopus. Decline did not mean immediate abandonment. It meant that the scale, direction, and purpose of activity changed. This distinction matters because historical narratives often prefer clean replacements. One city rises, another falls. One harbour opens, the older harbour closes. Real landscapes rarely behave so neatly. Alexandria drew power toward itself, but Thonis-Heracleion entered a long afterlife rather than an instant death. Its quays may have handled fewer international arrivals. Some basins may have silted more quickly as maintenance declined. Warehouses could be repurposed. Residential and sacred zones may have contracted while other areas remained active. The Nile itself intensified the change. The canopic branch that had made the port valuable was not a permanent channel cut into stone. It carried sediment, shifted course, divided, and gradually lost capacity. As river flow changed, so did the depth and navigability of the approaches. A harbour dependent on constant exchange between sea and river could suffer even before buildings visibly collapsed. If a channel became shallower, larger ships waited farther offshore or chose another route. If silt accumulated around quays, unloading became slower and more expensive. Maintaining a delta port required continuous labour. Channels needed clearing. Timber revetments needed replacement. Quays settled and cracked. Markers had to be moved when navigable water shifted. A prosperous city could mobilize workers and funds to manage these problems. A port losing traffic faced a dangerous cycle. Reduced revenue limited maintenance. Weaker maintenance discouraged traffic, and declining traffic further reduced revenue. The surviving evidence does not provide annual accounts of this process, but the logic fits the changing archaeological and environmental record. Alexandria also transformed the symbolic geography of arrival. Foreign ambassadors, merchants, scholars, and soldiers increasingly encountered Egypt through the new capital. Its palaces, lighthouse, harbours, and planned streets projected the authority of the Ptolemaic dynasty on a scale the older Delta port could not match. Thonis-Heracleion had once been the controlled maritime threshold where the sea of the Greeks met the Nile. Alexandria became a Mediterranean metropolis in its own right. Yet the older city's temples preserved another kind of authority. The Ptolemies did not govern by rejecting Egypt's sacred traditions. They invested in them. The Temple of Amun-Gereb and the ritual route toward Canopus allowed rulers to participate in forms of kingship older than Alexandria itself. This gave Thonis-Heracleion value even after its commercial dominance weakened. A harbour could lose cargo and still retain holiness. That religious continuity helps explain why late activity appears beside evidence of structural decline. People returned to places whose ground was becoming less secure. Offerings entered channels near buildings already affected by settlement. Repairs may have prolonged the use of precincts under increasing environmental pressure. Sacred attachment can preserve a site after economic logic begins to favour departure. Canopus experienced related changes, but it remained a separate city with its own religious and social history. The waterways joining the two settlements continued to matter for ritual, even as the wider delta landscape shifted. Later confusion often merges them because both now lie within the submerged archaeology of Aboukir Bay. In antiquity, however, their connection depended on movement between distinct places. The rise of Alexandria therefore belongs to the explanation of decline, but not as a complete cause. Political centralization redirected investment and trade. Environmental change weakened channels and waterfronts. Local subsidence damaged buildings. The heavy architecture of temples pressed on saturated soils. Over time, economic and geological pressures reinforced one another. No single explanation fully accounts for the city's long contraction. Thonis-Heracleion had always survived through adaptation. Its inhabitants repaired timber structures, shifted moorings, and worked around sediment, so disappearance would not have seemed inevitable to each generation. By Roman times, however, the balance had decisively changed. Alexandria controlled the major maritime networks, while the old Canopic branch continued to deteriorate. Portions of Thonis-Heracleion remained occupied or ritually active, but the city no longer stood at the centre of Mediterranean exchange. Its history narrowed from international gateway to vulnerable local landscape. The narrowing made environmental shocks more dangerous. A major port can recover from damage because wealth, labour, and political interest flow toward it. A declining one may repair only its most important structures, leaving other zones to erode, settle, or flood. When the ground beneath the Amun sanctuary failed in the 2nd century BC, the event struck a city already living in Alexandria's shadow, though it did not erase the entire settlement. The city's end was therefore neither a simple conquest nor a single commercial defeat. It was a prolonged transfer of importance, followed by continuing use on increasingly unstable ground. Alexandria changed where ships wanted to go. The Nile changed how they could reach the old port. The sediment beneath the city changed whether its buildings could remain standing. What followed is the most difficult part of the story to reconstruct. Some evidence points towards slow submergence measured across centuries. Other remains suggest sudden episodes when saturated ground collapsed beneath temples, ships, and quays. To understand how Thonis-Heracleion moved from decline into the sea, the city must be examined not only as history, but as geology. Geology does not preserve a clean ending. It preserves tilted blocks, buried hulls, distorted layers, drowned foundations, and sediments that record movement without explaining every moment of it. At Thonis-Heracleion, the central question is not whether the city sank, it is how the descent happened. Was the ground lowered almost imperceptibly across centuries, or did parts of the city suddenly fail beneath temples, quays, and ships? The most convincing answer is that both processes occurred. The city stood on young delta deposits built from mud, sand, organic material, and water. Such ground can appear stable while remaining compressible beneath the surface. Every flood adds sediment, every building adds weight. As water drains slowly from buried layers, grains settle closer together and the land surface lowers. This compaction becomes dangerous when massive stone structures stand on saturated soil barely above sea level. At the same time, the Mediterranean did not remain fixed relative to the land. Sea level rose, while local subsidence lowered the delta. From the perspective of anyone living there, the distinction mattered less than the result. Water stood progressively higher against embankments, channels, and foundations. A quay designed for one level became vulnerable at another. Drainage weakened. Storm surges reached farther inland. A major geological study published in 2004 estimated that the ancient sites in this sector had descended by roughly 8 meters over about 25 centuries. Approximately 4 to 5 meters could be explained by relative sea level rise and gradual compaction of delta sediments. Another 3 to 4 meters may have resulted from faster episodes of ground failure, when waterlogged layers lost strength and collapsed. The numbers are reconstructions, not measurements taken year by year. Different sectors did not necessarily move by the same amount, and later research has continued to refine the chronology. Still, the model captures the essential problem. Slow sinking explains much of the long-term submergence, but some archaeological features appear too violently displaced to fit a perfectly gradual descent. When saturated sediment is disturbed, it can behave less like firm ground and more like a dense fluid. Earthquake shaking is one possible trigger, but not the only one. Exceptional flooding can increase pore water pressure. Heavier architecture can overload weak layers. Erosion may remove support from a bank. A combination of stresses can cause localized failure without a regional earthquake. Walls tilt, foundations drop, and blocks slide toward adjacent channels. The Amun sanctuary preserves the clearest evidence for such an episode. During the middle of the 2nd century BC, a major failure affected part of the temple complex. Architectural elements collapsed into the southern canal, carrying ritual material and heavy blocks into a lower, water-filled space. The event was destructive, but it did not mark the instant disappearance of the entire city. Other areas continued to be used, repaired, or visited afterward. That distinction is crucial. A temple collapse offers a dramatic archaeological horizon, and dramatic horizons attract simple narratives. It is easy to imagine one earthquake striking at night, the ground opening, and every street vanishing beneath the sea. The evidence does not support that version. The city occupied multiple islands and sedimentary zones. Ground conditions varied over short distances. One sector could fail while another remained habitable. Later flooding and continued subsidence could then erase the boundary between sudden destruction and gradual abandonment. A major reassessment published in 2024 examined the competing models of slow drowning and rapid collapse. It emphasized that the archaeological and geological record contains evidence for both. Long-term, relative sea level rise and compaction are unavoidable parts of the story. Yet collapsed architecture, buried vessels, deformed deposits, and abrupt changes in elevation suggest episodes when the ground failed much faster. The challenge lies in dating those episodes and identifying their triggers. Earthquakes occurred in the eastern Mediterranean, but matching a specific tremor to a specific layer beneath Aboukir Bay is difficult. Written sources are incomplete, and geological signatures can be ambiguous. Floods, storms, local bank collapse, and structural loading can produce damage that resembles seismic failure. Scholars still debate how much weight each mechanism should carry. There is also a problem of survival bias. Archaeologists see structures that endured long enough to be discovered, while dismantled or eroded buildings leave weaker evidence. A dramatic collapse may preserve a coherent group of objects beneath clay, while centuries of slow decay erase context. The record can therefore make sudden events appear more visible than gradual processes, even when both were important. The city's own engineering may have delayed the inevitable while increasing local risk. Revetments, piles, quays, and rebuilt banks stabilized waterfronts, but they also concentrated weight and redirected water. Temple platforms created heavy loads on uneven deposits. Dredging kept channels open but may have steepened underwater slopes. Repairs solved immediate problems without removing the deeper instability of the delta. Residents would not have experienced this as a geological model. They would have noticed changes: a wall cracking, a landing place settling, water reaching farther across a path, a channel becoming difficult to cross, or a foundation requiring another repair. People adapted because the city had always required adaptation. Eventually, adaptation became retreat. Low areas flooded more often, damaged sectors were abandoned, temples and harbour installations lost support. As the canopic branch weakened and Alexandria drew commerce elsewhere, fewer resources were available for maintenance. Environmental decline and economic decline reinforced one another until the city fragmented into surviving pockets rather than functioning as one connected port. Even then, submergence continued. Roman period use in parts of the area did not stop the ground from sinking. Centuries later, the remaining islands disappeared below the bay, and sediment sealed what water had taken. The final landscape was produced by accumulation, compaction, structural failure, changing river flow, and relative sea level rise acting over a long duration. No single explanation fully accounts for every ruin. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. Thonis-Heracleion was destroyed neither by one earthquake nor by an invisible, perfectly steady tide. It was undone through the interaction of slow forces and sudden thresholds. For generations, the ground absorbed pressure until parts of it could absorb no more. Beneath the southern canal, temple blocks rest where a rapid collapse carried them. Elsewhere, quays and streets sank by increments that no witness could have narrated as catastrophe. Together they reveal a city disappearing at different speeds, its end stretched across human memory. Because only a fraction of the site has been excavated, the balance may change again. New trenches can reveal another failure surface, another repaired waterfront, or another phase of occupation later than expected. The geology remains an open investigation beneath the mud. That openness leads directly to the final question: what else still waits there, and how much of the city's unfinished story may survive beyond the mapped ruins? The city did not finish speaking when its mechanism of destruction became clearer. Every excavation season, conservation project, and specialized study has added another voice to the submerged landscape. Thonis-Heracleion remains less a completed discovery than an active investigation, one in which a buried hull, a handful of fingerprints, or two pieces of shaped wood can revise the story told by colossal statues. The ruins beneath the Aboukir Bay are not waiting to be emptied. They are waiting to be read with increasing precision. In 2021, researchers announced the identification of a long galley buried beneath nearly 5 meters of hard clay near the Temple of Amun-Gereb. The vessel measured more than 25 meters and lay beneath blocks that had fallen from the sanctuary. Its position linked naval architecture, geological failure, and temple destruction in one compressed context. The falling masonry appears to have forced the ship downward and helped seal it beneath sediment, preserving timber that open water would normally destroy. It was not the pleasure barge announced from Alexandria years later, and it was not Ship 17. It belonged to a different vessel, a different setting, and another episode in the port's long maritime life. The discovery also demonstrated how much remains concealed below the apparent seabed. Sonar may detect an anomaly, but thick clay can hide a complete archaeological context until careful excavation reaches it. Heavy sediment is both obstacle and protector. It limits visibility, slows investigation, and makes recovery technically demanding. Yet it also shields wood, rope, plant remains, and fragile deposits from currents and oxygen. The same material that erased the city from sight has preserved evidence that would have vanished on dry land. The 2023 campaign returned attention to the southern canal beside the Amun Sanctuary. Beneath collapsed architectural blocks, divers recovered ritual objects of silver, gold, alabaster, and other materials. Wooden structures dating to the 5th century BC added evidence for the early development of the waterfront and sacred precinct. East of the main temple, the Greek sanctuary associated with Aphrodite revealed imported bronzes, pottery, and religious activity within the Egyptian-controlled port. Together, the finds connected royal ritual, harbour engineering, and the lives of foreign communities in one part of the city. These discoveries did not produce a complete temple treasury frozen at one instant. Collapse, water movement, deliberate deposition, and later sedimentation created a complicated assemblage. Some objects may have been used in ceremonies, some may have been stored nearby, others may have entered the canal when walls failed. Archaeology advances by separating these possibilities rather than selecting the most dramatic one. What survives in the record suggests a sacred district repeatedly used, rebuilt, and finally broken apart by the unstable ground beneath it. In 2024, the focus narrowed from temples to fingertips. The study of prints on 16 terracotta figurines suggested that men, women, and younger artisans may all have participated in production, perhaps at different stages. The sample was small and the biological estimates cautious, but the research changed the scale of the city's human story. Anonymous workers, absent from decrees and royal images, returned through impressions left in wet clay. The discovery was not made by lifting another monument. It came from looking more closely at objects already recovered. In 2025, a specialized publication examined 2 one-armed wooden anchors from Sector G8, dated through their ceramic context to approximately 480 to 420 BC. Their recent publication should not be confused with a claim that they were newly discovered in 2025. Conservation and study often continue long after excavation. The anchors added to the evidence for local maritime technology during the city's prosperous centuries, when crews depended on shaped timber and accumulated experience to hold vessels safely in shallow, shifting water. The same year brought other announcements from Aboukir Bay and Alexandria, but geography matters. Roman period structures, statues, a long quay, and a wreck publicized after recovery operations in August 2025 most likely belong to an extension of Canopus, not to the center of Thonis-Heracleion. A 35-meter ceremonial or pleasure vessel reported later was found near the Temple of Isis on Antihodos, inside Alexandria's ancient eastern harbour. Shared water does not make shared context. Combining every spectacular find from the region into one lost city would recreate the confusion that archaeology has worked to resolve. By late 2025, 132 objects from Thonis-Heracleion, Canopus, and Alexandria's eastern harbour were prepared for display at the Grand Egyptian Museum. Among them were 3 colossal statues directly associated with Thonis-Heracleion, removed from the water, conserved, and placed beneath controlled light. These figures allow visitors to see details impossible to grasp in the bay's suspended silt. Yet the museum display also depends on distinctions between sites. The objects belong to a regional story of drowned ports, but each carries its own location and archaeological history. Most of the city remains underwater. Frank Goddio has estimated that only about 5% has been excavated or rediscovered. The number is best understood as the project's informed estimate, not a mathematically exact measurement of an urban area whose full boundaries are still being defined. Even so, it conveys the scale of what is unknown. Vast sectors remain mapped only remotely, lightly tested, or entirely buried beneath sediment. Leaving ruins in place is not a failure to investigate. International principles for underwater cultural heritage favour preservation where conditions allow, because excavation is irreversible. Once timber or organic material is removed from its stable waterlogged environment, conservation can take years and demand enormous resources. A monument lifted for display gains visibility, but loses part of its physical relationship with surrounding structures. Archaeologists must decide what to recover, what to sample, and what to protect beneath the bay for future methods. Those future methods may answer questions that cannot yet be solved. More precise sediment dating could refine the sequence of collapses. DNA or residue analysis might identify cargoes and food. New mapping may reveal residential districts, workshops, and harbour edges beyond the known plan. Additional inscriptions could clarify the earliest phases of the city or the changing administration after Alexandria's rise. A buried vessel may preserve a construction tradition not yet recognized. The evidence remains incomplete because the investigation is still alive. Thonis-Heracleion has already moved through several identities. It was a Nile gateway, a customs station, a sacred center, a bilingual port, a declining city, a drowned landscape, a legend without a location, and finally an archaeological site. None of these identities cancels the others. They accumulate like the sediment that covered its stones. The unanswered space is therefore not empty. It holds context that may challenge the neatest version of everything already reconstructed from the known ruins. And so the city rests where river and sea once negotiated the shape of Egypt. Above it, fishing boats cross a surface that gives no sign of temples, customs houses, or processional canals. Below, anchors remain where ships waited. Lead boats lie where worshippers placed them. Fingerprints survive inside clay figures. Temple blocks press into the mud beside timbers shaped by people whose names are gone. The deeper lesson is not that stone fails. Stone has always failed. It cracks, falls, sinks, and is reused. What seems more fragile is the chain of memory that allows a fallen place to remain part of the human story. Thonis-Heracleion disappeared from sight, then from geography, and almost from certainty. It survived because words were copied, because mud covered wood before it decayed, because inscriptions stayed legible, and because researchers learned to treat a dark bay as an archive. There is no final image of the city alive. No reconstruction can recover every roof, voice, colour, smell, or movement. The harbour seen in modern illustrations is an argument assembled from fragments. The people remain mostly anonymous. Even the moment of disappearance dissolves into centuries of settling ground, shifting channels, repair, abandonment, collapse, and rising water. Perhaps that is why the ruins linger so powerfully. They do not offer a single catastrophe with a clean beginning and end. They offer a slower truth. Human worlds can continue while their foundations weaken. Sacred rituals can persist after trade moves elsewhere. Families can adapt to changes that later generations recognize as the stages of disappearance. A city may be lost not when the first wall falls, but when the last route leading back to it is forgotten. Yet here, that route has reopened. It runs through sonar lines, waterlogged timber, broken decrees, miniature boats, and the patient work of divers moving through silt. Each discovery restores only a fraction, but fractions are how memory returns. For now, the bay keeps its distance, offering fragments slowly and refusing the comforting illusion that the past can ever be recovered whole. Far below the modern waves, the face of a stone ruler lies in darkness again after the lamps move away. Sediment settles over the carved eyes. The current passes softly across the old harbour, following no canal visible from above, and beyond the reach of the light, most of Thonis-Heracleion remains where it has waited for centuries, not silent, exactly, but speaking at the pace of the sea.